And one. Hello and welcome everyone to tonight's events presented by 192 Books and Paula Cooper Gallery. I'm Evan, the manager at 192 Books, and I could not be more thrilled to welcome you to our conversation tonight on Merve Emre's new annotated edition of Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, out now from Live Right Publishing. This gorgeously illustrated edition is filled to the brim with Oxford Don and literary critic Emre's generous and illuminating commentary, granting readers new insights into this legendary novel. In this edition's introduction and annotations, you'll find maps of London tracking the various characters' movements throughout the city, photographs of the people and places that inspired Woolf, notes from Woolf's earlier drafts and revisions, and revealing historical background information and context, altogether granting a wholly different understanding of the novel. These notes are so voluminous that I actually found myself in the novel. Peter Walsh actually walks by E. Dent and Co., so found myself in there. So I can't promise everyone will be able to do that, but it is a really revelatory book to flip through. At the store, we're often asked, which Woolf to start with, and everyone has their own answer. Mine's Mrs. Dalloway, and I always feel that same sort of envy for people who get to read Mrs. Dalloway or Woolf for the first time. And so with this new edition, I think those of us who love Dalloway get to read it anew, and that's really a wonderful gift. We are lucky enough to be joined tonight by Merve Emre herself and Michael Cunningham. We'll talk about Mrs. Dalloway, the life and work of Virginia Woolf, their shared love of Woolf, and anything and everything else they'd like to. If you don't already know, Merve Emre is an associate professor of English at the University of Oxford and the author of several books, including The Personality Brokers, and her essays have appeared in magazines such as The New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, the London Review of Books, and many, many more. In 2022, she's serving as a judge for the International Booker Prize. Michael Cunningham is a senior lecturer in English at Yale University, a Guggenheim Fellow, and an esteemed novelist, the author of novels such as A Home at the End of the World, The Snow Queen, and most importantly for tonight, The Hours, the brilliant and award-winning reimagining of Mrs. Dalloway. If we have time tonight, Merve and Michael will take questions from the audience, so you can send those to the email below, evan@192books.com. Whenever one pops in your head, don't wait till the end. If you think of anything, just send it over, and hopefully we might be able to relay those over to them tonight. And so without any further ado, I will pass it over to Merve and Michael. Enjoy, everyone.
Thank you, Evan.
Thank you. Thank you, Evan and Merve and everybody for being here. Merve and Evan and I were talking just before we sort of went live, and it occurred to us that why would we assume that everyone watching and listening to us right now knows Mrs. Dalloway? So Merve has agreed to very briefly convey to anyone who might benefit from the information, who is Mrs. Dalloway, who was Virginia Woolf, and what's this book about?
So if you know anything at all about Mrs. Dalloway, you probably know the famous first line of the novel. Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. And from there, you probably know that one part of the story is about a posh 50-year-old woman in London, a woman who has recently recovered from a severe bout of influenza, walking around the city in order to procure flowers for the party that she will be throwing that night, a party at which all of the members of the British ruling class will be attending. And that she spends her day buying her flowers, receiving her old suitor, Peter Walsh, receiving her husband who brings her flowers but cannot bring himself to tell her that he loves her, and then finally hosting a spectacular party. So that's one strand of the story. And the other strand of the story is about a war veteran named Septimus Smith, member of the working class, aspirationally middle class, who is suffering from a series of hallucinations after he has returned from the war. And while Clarissa Dalloway is buying her flowers and seeing her old suitor, he is wandering around London with his wife, Rezia, experiencing a series of hallucinations, seeing doctors, and finally, at the end of the novel, or toward the end of the novel, taking his own life. And the stories of Septimus and Clarissa intersect at the party later that night when she learns from his doctor that he has taken his own life. And it allows her to meditate on the rapture and the splendor of being alive, to feel the beauty and feel the fun, as Woolf writes. And so I think that's a good capsule summary of what the novel is about for those who might have tuned in just because your TV was broken or nothing was happening on Twitter or something like that. Yeah.
I taught a seminar on Mrs. Dalloway a while ago, and in one of those moments when you don't even realize you're going to say what you seem to hear yourself saying, that, oh, well, you know, it's a book about death and flowers.
I think that's right.
You know, you can if you on the general spectrum of totally inadequate summations, it's not the worst. It's a book about death and flowers.
It's interesting because can I say something on the death and flowers point? It's interesting because I was teaching a class for a friend who teaches in the US, and she had a group of very involved students who were reading Mrs. Dalloway and who didn't understand why they should read a novel about a wealthy white woman in 1923 throwing a party. And one of the things that I tried to explain to them, one of the things that I think is really beautifully explained by the critic Alex Wordling in his essay on Mrs. Dalloway, is that it's also an intensely political novel. It's a novel that is bitingly, viciously satirical about the conservative government that is in power and is about to be out of power in 1923, and the empire that is also in its death throes. And so I think I would say death and flowers and politics, and maybe those are the only things in life anyway. So
yeah. And yeah, you know, along those lines, I think it is sort of a given among many of us who think about these things at all that in a certain sense, Clarissa Dalloway and Septimus Warren Smith are a kind of semi-autobiographical diptych of Virginia Woolf, who, you know, had her good days and had her bad days. And if the good ones were very good, the bad ones were very dramatically bad. But yeah, thinking of it also as a political novel, I feel like, yeah, right. It's about, as I think Woolf herself wrote, something like Clarissa sees the truth and Septimus sees the insane truth.
yeah.
It's just things sort of alternate truth in which sparrows speak in Greek and trees are sentient, which doesn't seem categorically untrue. However, it also seems to me, thinking of it as a political novel set at the end of World War I, that Clarissa sort of stands in for the people of England who insist that after the unfortunate incident of World War I, everything can sort of get back to normal. There will still be parties. There will still be flowers to buy. And Septimus stands in for the opposite. That the harm will never be undone. What we thought of as normal life will not be returning anytime soon, if ever, which obviously speaks to our situation now with the pandemic. Would you talk? What do you think about that?
I mean, I think that's a very correct reading. And I think one of the reasons people have turned to this novel in particular during the pandemic is because, as you just so beautifully put it, it does capture those two very human competing impulses. On the one hand, the desire that I imagine many of us have to go back to something that feels like our ordinary social existence, for the act of going out on the streets and buying flowers and pressing against the bodies of other people on a crowded street in London, for that not to feel so extraordinary. Because of course it does right now, doesn't it? And it also feels frightening. It feels like there's something at stake when you do what you would have done so unthinkingly 2 years ago. And on the other hand, it feels that to go back to normal would be to ignore and to relinquish the possibility that the world could look very different from the way that it does now. And Michael, I don't know if you felt this way, but I do remember that early moment in the pandemic when it became clear, or when the pandemic made it clear that the structures that organize our world are deeply, deeply unjust. And all of a sudden, the revelation of that, the laying bare of the ordinary horrors of the way our lives are organized, made it seem like something different might be possible, that from this something new would be born. And the closer we get to normal, the more that possibility feels foreclosed to me.
Yeah.
And so I think this is a novel that's right on the cusp of that foreclosure. And that's one of the reasons it's a political novel, but it's very hard to know what the politics of this novel are, right?
Right. And to me, that is one of the differences between a good novel and a great novel. A good novel has what I suppose I will call a point of view. A great novel sees things too completely and deeply to have what we could call Virginia Woolf politics are this and not that. I think it's actually a mark of the scope of the book that you can't really say.
No, I think that's right. And I think in that sense, the novel is that kind of theory of the novel that you're articulating sits very close to Woolf's theory of character, too, that ultimately a character cannot be reduced to a single point of view. And I think about how one of my favorite passages from the novel is the moment when Clarissa is sitting in front of her looking glass when she's come back home and she's ascended to her attic room. And I feel like last time we spoke, you actually quoted that line to me with the narrow bed, right? Do you have it on the tip of your tongue right now?
Narrower her bed will be. That's not quite right, but it's
No, I think that narrower her bed. Yeah. And she looks in the mirror and she thinks about how the mirror tells this lie about her, that when we look in a mirror, we see ourselves drawn to a single point. I think she says dart-like, diamond-like. And yeah, it's great, isn't it? And she's like, I was someone else before I became this person that I am in this particular moment, and this mirror lies. It can't tell that truth, really.
About Clarissa, unless I've missed something, Clarissa Dalloway is the only character in all of Woolf's considerable, who doesn't want to say oeuvre every now and then?
You say it.
Well,
Yeah.
like a total pretentious asshole, but nevertheless, in her oeuvre, Miss Clarissa appears in other books.
Yes.
She's in The Voyage Out. There are stories about her, and it seems clear that there is something about this particular sort of outwardly rather trivial snobbish. The list goes on. This person who Woolf renders enormous, but who is not outwardly enormous. It seems to have stuck with her in ways that no other character quite did, until it was finally time to give Clarissa Dalloway, who had had walk-on roles and been a bit of a sort of caricature, more someone out of Dickens than someone out of Woolf, said, "Oh, all right, here's a whole novel just about you."
Right.
I would love to hear your thoughts about how it is that this particular person compelled Woolf and stuck with Woolf the way she did, out of all the characters she wrote about.
It's interesting. When she writes The Voyage Out, she sends a letter to her sister, Vanessa Bell, and she's quite explicit about the fact that Clarissa Dalloway is based on a good family friend of theirs named Kitty Max.
Mm-hmm.
And she says in her letter to Vanessa, "Kitty to a T, I wonder if she'll notice." And in some ways, right, the horror when you write people into your fiction is that they won't notice.
Right.
You want them,
Yeah,
you
right about your
know.
mouth. She won't notice or mind.
Or my, right. And as you mentioned, that original portrait is only satirical. It's incredibly, it's one-dimensional, it's quite flat. She's a figure to poke fun at. She's not a figure that you can feel sympathetic toward. And then when Woolf begins to write Mrs. Dalloway, and actually only 10 days after she sketches her initial plan for the novel, Kitty Max kills herself by throwing herself over the railings of her home and dying on the blue and green checkered floor underneath. And of course, that blue-green color repeats. It's all over Mrs. Dalloway. And I suspect that sometimes when people die, we feel like we didn't do them justice when they were alive. And writing or rewriting the dead becomes a way to try to enact our obligation to them, to do right by them a second time around, even when they're no longer able to see that or to perceive that. And so I do think that we were speaking earlier about the kind of autobiographical resonances for Woolf of the novel, but one of them is almost certainly the death of Kitty Max and the way that that compelled her to create this much more sympathetic portrait of a person whom she had poked a great deal of fun at in life.
And as I understand it, Kitty Max's suicide was more mysterious than some.
Yes, I think that's right. And in fact, there was a great deal of debate, and there's a wonderful section in the diary where she chronicles her debate with Roger Fry about whether it was really suicide or not. And actually, you know, Woolf can be, you know this, Woolf can be quite terrible in her diaries. And she even wonders in the diary whether we should mind it or not, because Kitty was such an incurable snob, she writes.
Yeah.
And so the kind of sympathy that perhaps it isn't possible to extend in life, you then can extend in fiction to a character who is, I think, only half real or real in a different way than the people whom we see at our actual parties. But I mean, I suppose I want to turn the question around to you, because Woolf is a character in your novel, and presumably a character that you too had a kind of preoccupation with. And I want to hear the story of that preoccupation as well.
Sure. Like so many things, it's about my mother. Short version. I'd always loved Virginia Woolf, but I'd loved a lot of one loves a lot of writers. And I grew up in Los Angeles in one of those households, of which there were many then, and of which there are some now, in which my mother was the wife and mother. That was her occupation. And as is so often the case with women who find themselves in that position, it was a job for which she was enormously overqualified. And rather than get a job, which she really could have done, and I'd have to say, in defense of my departed father, he did not insist that she stay home and take care of the house. She did that herself. So she turned her ambitions and her perfectionism inward. She could spend a whole day picking out a set of cocktail napkins and then realize they were wrong and take them back the next day. She did actually once bake a birthday cake, find it less than satisfying, throw it away, and bake another birthday cake. And I was sort of thinking about something that I might write about Virginia Woolf. I didn't know what, but one of the starting points was this thought that if you take Virginia Woolf and my mother, who outwardly were very, very different people. I mean, they were women with opposable thumbs. That's about as far as their outward similarities go. And they were obsessive and in suit of an impossible perfection. And what really got me started with this book was the idea that if you remove the end result, if you take away books that we are still talking about, for instance, today, and the idea of a cake that could banish sorrow, we tend to value the one more than do the other. Though there's much to be said for a really good cake. I got to thinking that if you take away the finished product and just stay with the desire on the part of two women, both of whom lived in different worlds, but in worlds in which women tended to be underestimated, as they often still are, and just look at the desire to create something that you can't create, something beyond yours or really anybody's capacities. Something so perfect that all you can do is attempt and fail again, try hard, fail better. And this will probably sound a little funny, but I started thinking that if I approach it that way, my mother and Virginia Woolf can be in the same book. And my mother can stand unembarrassed beside Virginia Woolf. And there I went. And, then 17 years and several suicide attempts later, there's the novel.
And, the word that Woolf uses to describe what you're talking about, that perfection that one can never quite achieve, whether in the form of a novel or in the form of a party, is an offering. That's the word that knits together, I think, quite explicitly in Mrs. Dalloway, Clarissa as the perfect hostess, and the offering that she makes through the party, the way that she draws these disparate people together into the same space and allows them to think things and feel things and say things to one another. And that is essentially the work of the novelist too. That is the offering that the novelist makes, to draw one's mother and a character based on Virginia Woolf into the same novel and to allow them to converse across space and time with each other. So the way that you've described that just seems so perfectly to intuit what is being described in Mrs. Dalloway about the parallels between the hostess and the writer. So I like that a lot.
Well, and speaking about characters who are women and writers who are women,
Yeah.
you, in the introduction to your book, you quote Eric Auerbach, who said, Woolf's writing overflowed with such good and genuine love, but also in its feminine way with irony, amorphous sadness, and doubt in life. Do you think of Woolf as a feminine writer? Is there any such thing?
No, I mean, I think you certainly have characters who are women, right? But as for Woolf herself, I think her own relationship to gender is so queer, and her relationship to her writing as something that is gendered is also extraordinarily queer. And I think we see moments of this certainly in Mrs. Dalloway, but I think we see it much more explicitly in a novel like Orlando. So no, I don't think of her as being a feminine writer. And I think when Auerbach writes that, he overemphasizes aspects of her that I think you see very clearly into The Lighthouse, that sympathy and that genuine good love. But what he ignores, I think, is her deeply satirical, at times incredibly vicious representations of people, some that she knew and some who were more or less types that she saw around her. So I think that only tells half the story of Woolf's style. But I also think that of all the writers that one would want to sort of firmly claim for a gender category, Woolf might be the last person I would go to for that particular exercise.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We talked earlier, by the way, we didn't rehearse this. That would be silly, but
But we had a nice conversation. And actually, do you know what my favorite part of that conversation was, which I wish we had already gotten into? But you and I were both given, or rather, you were given Virginia Woolf. You were given Mrs. Dalloway by someone that you had a crush on,
Yep.
right? And I gave Mrs. Dalloway to someone that I had a crush on. And so one of the things I was going to ask you is like, why is this the crush book? Like, why is this the novel that people when they're young give to one another or read because someone that you have certain feelings for has read it? Because I don't think all novels reward that kind of relationship. Not all novels can be the kind of triangulating point in that kind of relationship. So do you remember what it was for you?
Well, I do, and it was actually not in any literal way a gift of love. It was more like this. I had a huge crush on a girl in my high school. Every high school has this girl. She's tough and mean and smarter than everybody, and usually after school, her boyfriend picks her up her 20-year-old boyfriend picks her up in a Mustang, and off she goes to her vastly cooler life than yours. And somehow I was talking to her. I had her to myself for a few minutes and was nattering on about how, something like how I thought Leonard Cohen was superior to Bob Dylan, which is a debatable argument. But I was just riffing. I just say anything this person might find interesting, and she kind of sneered at me and said, "Yeah, but do you think James Joyce was greater than Virginia Woolf?" Which stopped me, because I mean, I wasn't so, I'm 15. I'm a Los Angeles 15-year-old, not all that precocious kid. And I mean, I knew those weren't the names of rock bands, but I'd never read them. And never really expected to. And I confess it to you that I went to the library at my school, the double wide on cinder blocks where we kept the books, and Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway was the only book by either of those writers that was on the shelves. I took Mrs. Dalloway out. I was the only person who'd ever checked it out. And although it was completely baffling to me, I was so not ready for it to, not ready to understand what it was even about, nevertheless connect to it, but I did. I wasn't so foolish as to be unaware of or immune to that language. I had never seen sentences like that. I hadn't known you could do that. I had not seen language so balanced and nuanced and incisive and surprising, and sentences with 2 parentheticals and 3 semicolons, not meant to show off, but simply because that was the best way to convey an incredibly complicated idea married to an emotion, married to a political system. And I just thought, fuck me. I hope it's okay to sort of say that on the air. Fuck me. How did she do this? How does anyone do this? And
Right.
although it was no help to me at all, you know, but by the time I got around saying, so I read Mrs. Dalloway. Excuse me, my boyfriend's over there in his GTO. I gotta go. But in a funny way, although it was not intended as a gift, it turned out to be a gift, and it really got me started as some kind of very rudimentary reader. And then things changed. What about your gift of Mrs. Dalloway?
My gift, I mean, my story is not dissimilar from yours, which was that I wasn't a Los Angeles kid. I was a Long Island girl.
Yeah, you know,
I'll say it like that.
Kind of sister cities, yeah.
I was an immigrant to this country. I was born in Turkey. We moved to the United States when I was young, when I was 4. And I was a very awkward and quite, on the one hand, quite nerdy kid, and on the other hand, a kind of nerdy kid with a mean streak. But with a defensive mean streak, because I felt so outside of the sort of American suburb where we had moved. And I spent almost every lunch hour in the library. And when I was, in 6th grade, I made a friend, a boy who wanted to read with me. And I thought this was the most extraordinary thing in my entire life. And we read for whatever reason, and it must have been because a teacher had kind of given one of us these books. I remember that we started with Fitzgerald, and we read The Great Gatsby and The Side of Paradise. And I have a very vivid memory of being on a Long Island Railroad train going from the town where we grew up in Long Island into the city, having an argument about whether Gatsby or The Side of Paradise was better. And then we read Mrs. Dalloway, and we must have read it when I was away for the summer, because when I started this project, I found this letter that he had written me, and I speak about this in the introduction a little bit, this letter that he had written me while we were away, debating whether the characters that we ought to identify with were Clarissa Dalloway and Peter Walsh, or because he had recently read Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises, Jake Barnes and Lady Brett Ashley. And for those of you who need a refresher on your Hemingway, you might remember that the reason that relationship between Jake Barnes and Lady Brett actually doesn't quite work out is because he has been made impotent by the war, and she is a sexually voracious English divorcee. And I don't think either of these character pairings really got at the nature of our relationship. But finding that letter and thinking about how important character and Virginia Woolf's construction of character had been to that initial reading experience, and the way it allowed us to kind of try to build some sort of bridge between our lives and the lives that we read about in fiction. That was, for all the humor and the kind of misreading of that moment, that still sticks in my mind as something important.
Clarissa and Peter Walsh.
Yeah, well, I think I'd know if I were a sort of repressed posh lesbian at this point. I don't think I don't think I am.
I think it would be apparent. Yeah,
I think we know.
It would be apparent by now. There is this notion that first the writer writes the book and then the reader writes the book.
Mm.
Okay, it's Derrida. I didn't make it up, but
Yeah.
but I do believe it. It's certainly, at least insofar as I think the clear fact that no two people ever read the same novel, even though we're reading the same words, our associations are always going to be different. And I can only imagine, having never produced an annotated version of a novel with which I was already familiar, but I can imagine that annotating a novel, as you have done so beautifully, must affect your sense of the novel and your reading of the novel. You could even say the way in which you rewrite the novel for your own purposes. What about that?
No, I think that's, yes, I think that's very beautifully put. I think the great joy of annotating is that it actually lets you be quite promiscuous. You get to be many different readers at the same time. And so if you want to read and be a kind of historically minded reader, and you are interested in how the empire is in the details of the statues that Peter Walsh walks by, you can be that kind of reader. And there's one version of the novel that springs up in your mind. And if you're interested in tracking Woolf's language of the moment, and you want merely to attend to that word, the moment, which repeats over and over again, you can do that. And you can be the reader who is interested in Woolf and the kind of raptures of time, of being a body in time. If you are the kind of reader that is interested in biography, then you can position the diaries alongside the novel and think about the entry where Woolf writes about the mad scene and how writing the mad scene is so trying. It makes her squint. She can only write 50 words at a time because she's drawing on her own experience. And so one of the things I like about annotation, and the way that I think it's different from being a critic, is that when I write an essay, I'm usually only offering one reading. And if I'm in the classroom and I have an hour to lecture on a novel, I'm usually only offering one reading. But I like the ability, I think a little bit like Orlando, to shift in and out of different bodies of different readers and to try to bring them all into the same frame. And that to me is it's just very fun. It's a very fun way to be. Did you read it? How carefully did you read it when you were writing the hours?
Here's what I did. I read it very carefully. Well, you never know if any of these ideas are good ideas, but I did not read much criticism about it.
Mhm.
I just wanted to react to it on my own. Um, I read it and read it again, and then closed the book. And some days with considerable difficulty would not permit myself to open it again,
Mm.
so that I would be writing about Virginia Woolf in a style that in some ways reflected hers without, God help me, any attempt to imitate it.
Mm.
So that her way of looking at the world and her way of writing a sentence was sort of one of the things about doing these talks outdoors is, it's quite lovely, but the shadows keep shifting, and Hell's Angels go by every now and then. There's not, um, but so what I wanted was was almost the effect of somebody had to take a flash picture in your face.
Mm.
So that the weird amorphous blobs of color remain, but but not the image. I wanted it to be an homage to the way she wrote and the way she thought, without any attempt at ventriloquism.
Mm. I mean, I think the other thing that I thought about when you said that what the novel aspires to, or the offering of the novel as a kind of unattainable perfection, were her drafts for the novel, particularly the books that make up the Hours manuscript and the sort of copious notes for the novel that are in the New York Public Library, and how, together with the diaries, they show that she was almost never happy when she was writing it, that she was her own worst critic, and that what we take to be, I think, one of the classics or canonical text, a text with which one would not dream of finding faults, was for her riddled with problems. And the way she was constantly trying to sort those problems, writing entire chapters or interludes and then throwing them out, much like the birthday cake, right? And to me, that was also a kind of extraordinary and possibly sort of demystifying discovery, the anxiety that haunted her throughout the writing of it, and also the terrible reviews that attended to it when it first came out. I mean, some really punishing reviews.
And welcome, yes, welcome,
Yeah.
welcome to trying to make anything, especially something that revolutionary and that great. Yeah. I think she suffered from a dearth of confidence beyond that which afflicts most writers. Though I don't know any writer I respect who feels entirely confident. And even if it's not a book anywhere near Mrs. Dalloway, even if it's just a, barely good enough book, I think that for a lot of novelists, what is published is forever surrounded by the nimbus of all the other versions,
Mm.
which can make it hard to look at the book ever again and hard to talk about the book.
What are the ghosts that haunt the Hours?
Oh God, so many. Beginning with the fact that I, in a very early draft, my contemporary Clarissa Dalloway was a gay man. I wanted to make it more blatantly queer. To the whole sections I put, Clarissa in Mrs. Dalloway has a grown daughter to whom some space is allotted, and I wrote all that, and then you know what?
We're
No.
done.
Yeah, yeah. I think for me, it's more what was discarded.
Hmm.
Though I'm sure I could find plenty to be mortified by in terms of what was in terms of what's added as well. Um, but also, I mean, if you're going to survive, and Wolf only survived to a point. I mean, it's arguable that part of what drove her to suicide was her her despair after she wrote a novel she just finished between the acts. But if you're going to survive as a writer, you simply have to, at a certain point, say, you know what, this will do.
Right.
This is the best version of this that I can produce now. There are other versions that might be better. I don't know, but here it is.
Mm.
On on to the next one.
Right. Right. And I think too that those middle period novels, let's say starting with Mrs. Dalloway and then to The Lighthouse, Orlando, and The Waves, those are the novels where she's not only trying to exorcise the demons of her own insecurity, but also her family, her mother, particularly the death of her mother.
Yeah. Yeah.
And once she's done with that, then it's on to a new kind of novel, a new kind of style, right?
Yeah. Her mother and father are finally exorcised into the lighthouse and then on to Orlando.
Right. Right.
But well, here's it's an unfun fact about Woolf's early work that maybe not everyone knows. Her first two novels were published by Duckworth and Company,
Mm.
and her editor was one. I think it was Gerald. There was the Gerald and a George. Anyway, it was one of the Duckworth brothers, who was Virginia's half brother. Both her parents were married twice, and her editor for the first two novels had molested her since she was at least 12 years old.
Yeah. Yeah.
Always going to edit your books.
Yeah. Yeah. And in the drafts, the character of Hugh,
Yeah,
sort of unctuous, oily Hugh, who she meets carrying that dispatch box in the park, Hugh gets described as like a brother, but not quite. You wouldn't want to know what went on with him and the servant girls. And he had this fixation, this dirty fixation with Freud. And in the early drafts, he's made into much more of a molester. And those transgressions are explicitly tied to the idea that he is like a sibling, but not quite one, the way that a half brother might be.
yeah.
And then that gets cut from the novel in its final draft. But no, I think, I really love Hermione Lee's biography. Her Woolf biography, I think, is just stupendous. And I think she does a really good job dealing with the history of the harassment that both Virginia and Vanessa endured at the hands of their half brother, and what we can and what we can't know about it from this vantage point. But no, I mean, it seems almost unthinkable that he would edit. But I think that side of the family had a lot of money, right?
Yeah, and I mean, this is one might imagine that the first couple of novels, which are quite good, but certainly not the novels on which her reputation is based, might have been in part. I'm out on a limb here. In part, some desire on her part to show that motherfucker that he had not damaged her to the point at which she could not write a relatively traditional novel with a beginning, middle, and end. And then she and her husband Leonard moved to Richmond, founded their own printing press, the Hogarth Press, which is still with us today. And then she could write what she wanted to.
Yeah. Well, and interestingly, The Voyage Out has, I think, the first and possibly, well, in addition to the kiss that's alleged, the forcible kiss that's alleged, that Sally alleges against Hugh and Mrs. Dalloway, The Voyage Out has the first and only heterosexual kiss in all of Virginia Woolf's writing, which I find very interesting. And then she's like, never again, no more.
I know, I just can't.
Yeah, no more straight. The straights can't kiss anymore.
Yeah. Flowers and other things will have to stand in for it. And I feel like I really want to hear from other people. Though I could talk to you literally for hours about this.
Yeah, should we take some questions?
Yeah. If people have questions, why don't we do our best to answer them?
Okay, Evan says the questions are a bit quiet.
Okay.
So
then we can keep on.
I think we can keep on. I mean, one thing that I want to talk to you about, and an experience that we share that you mentioned, is that we've both visited Charleston and Monk's house, and one of the things, and they're such different houses, and they were such different sisters, right? And I'm curious whether you were as fascinated with Monk's house as I was when you visited, or whether Charleston just took the shine right off of the writing cottage, Virginia Woolf's writing cottage, and her bedroom, and the Shakespeares that she bound by her own hand.
Yeah. Vanessa was the wild thing in the family, and a painter, I think, of much more renown then than she is now. And Virginia could be snide about her sister's limitations, but she also felt like Virginia, was the sort of spinster-ish figure who lived a conscripted life, and Vanessa had a big house not far from Virginia and Leonard's summer house in Rodmell, and God, the house at Charleston, Vanessa's house, it's probably her greatest work of art, and you can see how she and her second husband, boyfriend, whatever, Duncan Grant, would just kind of sit around and say, I think there should be hollyhocks painted on the wainscoting. and then you visit Virginia and Leonard's house, which is nearby, and it's lovely, but very austere.
Yeah.
There's not really a chair you really want to sit in.
Yeah. It was funny when my husband and I were there, because we drove down right before I started annotating this, and there was a group of British women tourists that were sort of touring various national heritage sites. And they confessed to having never heard of Virginia Woolf. They only knew about Jane Austen. And I think about that moment in The Voyage Out, where the first iteration of Clarissa Dalloway carries a copy of Persuasion with her to read to Dick, to Richard Dalloway, because he keeps talking about our incomparable Jane. And so it was very funny to see those types of women showing up at Virginia Woolf's house, not knowing who she was exactly. So we found that very, very amusing. But the other thing that I liked very much about Monk's house, I mean, one of the frustrating things about it, right, is that none of the books were actually her books, that they've removed all of the books from the house and they've sent them to a collection. I'm blanking on where it is, either in Washington or Georgia. But, when we were in her bedroom, there was this wonderful docent that was showing us around. And she was, this very sort of dark haired, small face, English major from Columbia, was carrying a sort of thick Henry James novel under her arm, was clearly sort of an American that had come to England for a summer to have her sort of Isabel Archer adventures there. And she was showing us the two most extraordinary objects in Woolf's room that belonged to her, one of which was a cloud glass, a painter's mirror that reflects things through this convex lens. And so what you were saying earlier about taking a photo with very bright exposure and just having the kind of patterns of color, right? This is what that mirror kind of does, right? It gives you intensified color from a distance without giving you proportion, without giving you verisimilitude, right? It doesn't mime. And this amazing iridescent shell called Venus's ear that you could, I thought at least you could hear voices. You could hear the voice of the sea in it. And I thought for all of Monk's House's austerity and for how low it lies and how gray it can feel, there was something a little bit enchanted about having those objects, having those objects at hand. Yeah.
It's not about it. It's a different sort of. It's not a voluptuous enchantment. It's a very particular form of enchantment. And I was working on this book then, and sort of hiked from the house to the Ouse River, which is where she drowned herself. And you're out on the downs, and it doesn't seem like there could be a river anywhere nearby because it's flat and green anyway, finally you go up an embankment and you're on the other side, and there is the River Ouse, which is essentially a sort of river-sized mud puddle. And it helped me to realize that when I thought of Virginia Woolf walking into a river, I was imagining it as something like Anna Karenina going under the train.
Right.
And I was imagining the river as something like the Mississippi with trees and bits of houses and dead cows, and the only decision really was to jump. And then that was that. And I realized, seeing the river, how very, very determined she was.
Right.
And seeing that, going there and seeing that, just further heightened maybe one of the things I love most about Woolf and her work is many things, but as we know, on her bad days, during her bad periods, she went into states for which the word depression feels a little too mild. From which she eventually emerged. And during her periods of emergence, wrote as convincingly and directly and deeply as any writer, certainly in English, I could name about the simple joys of being alive. Life, London, is danger.
Yeah.
And I felt like if anybody can go to that level of hell, come back and tell us, but it's fantastic. It's beautiful. Lap it up. Do your best to love it. But you can trust that.
Yeah. Yeah, I maybe just the very last thing I'll say, because I realize we're at the hour, is that something that I think about a lot is that when Septimus decides to kill himself, the line that she added at the proof stage is that he did not want to die, life was good. And the sort of agonizing realization that someone would kill themselves in order for life to remain good, that seems to me to be at the heart of the novel. That sentence sits at the heart of the novel for me.
Is it any wonder we love her so?
Thank you so much. This was a lovely
Good to talk.
A lovely conversation. It was lovely to speak with you. Thank you, Evan.
Thank you, Evan.
Oh, thank you both so much. That was lovely just to even be a, a witness to. So I'm so glad that we were able to have you both tonight. Thank you again, Michael Cunningham and Merve Emre. If you'd like to get a copy of this incredible edition of Annotated Mrs. Dalloway, we have them in store at 192 Books. We're open every day from 11 to 7 for masked, socially distanced browsing. So come on by. You can send us an email at info@192books or give us a call if you want to reserve a copy. And if you can't make it down to Chelsea, you can order from our bookshop page. There's a link right below, and they'll ship it directly to you. If you missed the beginning of tonight's talk or you want to share it with a friend, there's going to be a recording immediately following it. So right on this page and on YouTube. So just keep an eye out for that. You can check our website, 192books.com, for more information on upcoming events, including our next event, a talk with Colm Toy-Bean on his new novel, The Magician. That's going to be September 21st, also at 5 p.m. So we'll hope to see you again. Thanks again to Merve and Michael and to all of you who watched tonight, and have a great evening.